Would you please join me in welcoming one of the original members of the Global Philanthropy Forum, Laurene Powell Jobs, joined by another original member.
Where do you want me to stand? Okay, thought so. Thanks, Jane. My name is Laurene Powell Jobs, and I'm the founder of a local organization that works with youth in impoverished communities nearby here. Towards the end of his administration, President Clinton came to East Palo Alto, which is right next door to Mountain View, to speak about the digital divide, and he stopped by College Track to visit with some of our students. His 15-minute visit turned into more than an hour of listening to students who are the first in their family to graduate from high school and to enter college. It was a magical day. The fact that the President of the United States took the time to listen to these students is a gift that they will carry with them throughout their entire lives. I'm certain that they'll go on to affect the lives of others. President Clinton understands that when people are given hope and a reason to believe in their own best promise, it frees them up to imagine a future of their own creation. Since leaving office, President Clinton has spent his enormous personal capital in the most exquisite way to create a future worthy of children from East Palo Alto to East Africa. He's taken on the big, thorny issues of our time: poverty, health, climate change, education. And he's leveraged his singular commitment into a truly global one. Over $10 billion in specific commitments to inspire change and deliver results have been put to work as a result of the Clinton Global Initiative. And he's pulling together the best of individuals. A London mayor who was considered wacky 10 years ago, who now sets the standard in cutting carbon emissions. A healthy HIV-positive 6-year-old girl in a polka dot dress who takes her medications in a Lesotho clinic daily, twice daily, right on time, and is going to school thanks to antiretrovirals that were donated by the Clinton Foundation in 2004. And CEOs and heads of state who know that the most influential philanthropist of our time will not keep company with them unless they keep their promises and see the results. Through his sheer attention to issues, he inspires others to pay attention. And more centrally, through his actions, he inspires others around the globe to take action. It's my distinct honor to welcome President Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Laurene, for your introduction, for your work, for giving me a chance to see those kids so long ago, and for sticking with them. I'd like to thank Jane Wells and all the people with the Global Philanthropy Forum for the wonderful work they do and for giving me a chance to come back and address you. I'd like to thank Larry Page and Sergey Brin for letting me come back to Google. I had one of the most interesting days of my post-presidential life here. I left more confused than I came, but somehow amorphously convinced that the future was in good hands. And I'd like to thank Larry Brilliant for the great job that he does here with Google's philanthropic efforts. I have been generally brief. Jane gave me a kind of a briefing of who's spoken before, what they've said, and I was trying to think of what, if anything, I could do that would be value added here today. And I think what I'd like to do is to focus on why you can make more of a difference than private citizens committed to the public good have ever been able to make before. and why it's more important, and try to do it with a few illustrations, and then maybe leave some time for questions. But let me say, first of all, whenever I go to like a college audience or a business audience, I always start with what to most people in this room will seem painfully self-evident, almost simplistic questions, where I tell people that you can never understand the world you're living in and the one you want for your children unless you can ask and answer 5 simple questions. What is the fundamental nature of the 21st century world? Is it a good or a bad thing? How would you like to change it? What steps are necessary to change it? Who is supposed to take the steps? And then over a period of 20 minutes or so, I try to make the case that the fundamental nature of the 21st century world is its interdependence, not just globalization of economics, but information technology and culture and growing diversity and interdependence within all societies. Then I say, is it a good or bad thing? It is both. It's great for us or we wouldn't be here. It's hard to attack it if you've had the life that Larry and Sergey have built and all these employees here at Google. But as you've already heard today, and I'm sure yesterday, half the world's people aren't part of this deal. They're still living on less than $2 a day. And there is growing inequality even amidst economic growth in poor and wealthy countries alike. One of the reasons you got such a big reaction against more trade in America is that we just had 5 years of continued economic growth, a 40-year high in corporate profits, 5 years of increasing worker productivity, median wages are stuck, and for the first time in this decade, while we've had all this growth, the percentage of people working full-time falling below the poverty level has increased by 4%. The percentage of people working full-time who have lost their health insurance for themselves and their families has increased by 4%. And you can amplify those numbers in poorer countries. So the divide is there and it's growing. In addition to being unequal, the world is unstable because of our shared vulnerabilities to terror, to avian influenza, to all these problems with which you're quite familiar. And it is completely unsustainable. Not only because of climate change, but of a related condition that I think is likely to bite us more severely even before the worst implications of climate change, and that is the accumulated combinations of resource depletion and population explosion. We're going between now and 2050 from a world with 6.5 billion people to one with 9 billion people. Almost all the growth is in the countries least able to provide opportunity for the people who live there. And at the same time, we see a substantial loss of topsoil, forest cover, probably the biggest disappearance of species on Earth, certainly in all of human history, but probably for 500,000 years. And there's a big debate within the professional community about when we're going to run out of oil. Matthew Simmons, no great tree hugger, a conservative Republican, close friend of the Bush family, who's made a lot of money in petroleum investments, believe that we only have 35 years of recoverable oil left. Now, the Cambridge Research Institute, which is affiliated with the industry, believes we may have 150 years left. But most people think even the most optimistic people say, no, we've got at least 100 years of recoverable oil left. That is, being able to get oil out of the ground at a net positive energy balance. Forget about greenhouse gas emissions for the moment. Just how much oil have you got left? The oldest city in human civilization based on carbon dating is Jericho in the Middle East, about 10,000 years old. That means that the optimists say we've got 1% of civilization left to figure out how to live without oil. And 70% of oil in America is used for transportation, except for jet fuel, for which we have not yet found a sufficiently powerful biofuel substitute. We don't need oil to get around at all. But think of that. We also use oil for plastics, for chemicals, for fibers, for lots and lots of things in our society rest on an oil platform. So we're dealing with not only the potentially calamitous consequences of climate change, but all these resource depletion issues that are bearing down on us just as the world is primed for another population explosion. I come from a farming state, and I lived on a farm when I was a little boy. When I go to places where I work now, once I get out in the country, the first thing I do is kneel down and grab the ground to see what the soil is like and how much of it's there and what's happened to it. In the last decade, only Brazil and Argentina in the whole world have dramatically increased their capacity to produce grain. They have over 20 feet of topsoil, the best in the world. And good for them, but there's no way in the wide world that those two countries can feed 2.5 billion more people. The United States, Canada, Europe, all of our breadbasket countries in the world, we've held our own. We've done quite well. But unless you think everybody's going to start eating those little dried space packets, we got a serious problem facing us. So the world's good and bad. How should we change it? Question 3. We have to go to a set of integrated communities with empowered people, locally, nationally, and globally. And you cannot, if you believe the world is interdependent, you cannot have integrated communities without empowered people, and you cannot empower individuals without more integrated communities. The two things are inextricably linked. Every successful community, Google, the Tennessee women's basketball team, a family with 4 kids and a limited budget and oodles of happiness. Every successful community has 3 things in common. There is a sense that the opportunity to participate to the fullest of your ability is there. There is a sense of broadly shared responsibility for the success of the endeavor, whatever the endeavor is. And there is a sense of genuine belonging. The last is intangible, but profoundly important. So much of the modern world is bedeviled by identity conflicts, confusion, and destruction. When the terrorist bombs occurred in London a couple years ago, they weren't nearly as damaging in terms of lives lost as the lives lost in the United States on 9/11, not only Americans, but people from 200 other countries. But psychologically, they were perhaps more traumatic. Why? Because the United States was invaded in our category of national thinking. The British terrorists were homegrown. So if you read the British press, there was article after article after article of people saying, I don't get this. I work with these people. They live in our neighborhoods. We go to sports events or movies on the weekend. We share meals. Our kids play. What happened? They did not feel that they belonged. Their sense of identity separated them from us and prevented the emergence of community. In the last year or so, I can't remember exactly when, Amartya Sen has written a beautiful book about this called Identity and Violence, which I highly commend to all of you. But it's an amazing thing to contemplate how you think about yourself in relation to others. But we here in the United States and throughout the world, we have to be trying to create these integrated communities. And how do you do it? Well, of course there has to be a security strategy to try to protect people from those who would wreck the enterprise. But as we have seen over and over again, and we get fresh evidence of every single day in Iraq, this morning I met with the leaders of the Kosovo Albanian Muslim community and the Serbian minority as they try to set off on a path to independence to overcome the horrible ethnic cleansing that they were bedeviled by in the late 1990s until we stopped it there. Everywhere you see, in an interdependent environment, it is impossible to kill, jail, or occupy everybody who disagrees with you. And alas, for the purist, If you can't kill, jail, or occupy everybody that's against you or might be against you, you have to practice politics. You have to make deals. You have to make deals. It sounds sort of bad until you put it against the alternative, doesn't it? Remember what Churchill said, democracy is absolutely the worst form of government except for all the others. So in an interdependent environment, if you can't kill, jail, or occupy all your actual or potential enemies, you have to build a world with more partners and fewer adversaries. And as I think one of your previous speakers demonstrated in graphic form, it is always cheaper than going to war. The single most expensive thing you can do in a modern society is fight. It is the single costliest thing you can do. I know you got a little cookie demonstration about the defense budget, but let's just take Afghanistan and Iraq. I support trying to save the moderate Muslim democracy in Afghanistan and trying to prevent the Taliban from once again reasserting their repressive rule against women and children and their distorted theocracy and giving the Al-Qaeda room to run around again. And I don't support our policy in Iraq, but whether you're for or against either one of them, just think about the money. Afghanistan is a small country. We have already spent over $100 billion there. Had we been free to spend it in non-military ways, we could have probably tripled per capita income or quadrupled or quintupled it there. In Iraq, we are soon going to hit the $500 billion mark. There are about 26 million people there. What about the other 6.5 billion people in the world? And so this is always less expensive. So put the security thing to the side. There will be a security policy. We will spend wisely or foolishly. We will be effective or ineffective, but we have to have one. And it will involve homeland security and all the things around the world. But it's never going to be enough because you can't kill, jail, or occupy everybody who's against you or who might be. The good thing about making a world with more partners is that we know how to do it. It's not only less expensive, we know how to do it. We know that the government has a role through diplomacy and through humanitarian options. Most successful military operation of the Bush administration in a Muslim country, with the exception of Afghanistan, if we hold, was the humanitarian airlift in Indonesia after the tsunami. It's the biggest Muslim country on earth, 200 million people. After Iraq, our approval rating plummeted to 30%. After the tsunami, it rose to 60%. The only thing that happened was they saw helicopters and people in uniform dropping lifelines and food and medicine, and they saw American government representatives helping them to rebuild again, and they saw people from our religious and non-religious NGO communities trying to help put the country back together again. And it was lots cheaper than going to war. So we know how to put the 130 million kids who never go to school in school, and to give them adequate learning materials, and to use technology to sort of leap generations of traditional education development. And it's not that expensive. We know how to end extreme hunger, and it's not that expensive. We know how to empower farmers to bring in a crop, and even in the most difficult circumstances. We know how to make a future that skips the destructive energy use patterns of the industrial civilization, and how to do it in a way that empowers people economically. We know that every increase of cell phone penetration of 10% in a developing country increases GDP by 0.6%, because it creates all these little Larrys and Sergeys. You know, there's a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates around the corner there. Some little person figuring out if I just had a cell phone, I could call and figure out whether these people are screwing me on my farm prices. I mean, you laugh, but it's really true. It's a question of, what did I drop? My cell phone. No, it's something that's here. But this is really important. We know this. We know that through individual empowerment and community building, working together, at affordable rates along proven paths, we can move toward this world. We can do it in healthcare, we can do it in education, we can do it in economic empowerment, we can do it in fighting specific terrible scourges like AIDS, and we can do it in fighting climate change and resource depletion in a way that empowers and enriches people instead of holds them back. So we know it. Last question, who's supposed to do it? Well, we all are. Would we be better off if we had a different government policy in America on climate change? You bet we would. Should we keep lobbying for it? Of course. Should we sit around and feel sorry for ourselves and whine and point fingers until it happens? No. Because private citizens have more power to do public good than ever before. Are we better off? I think we are now with the change in the Congress. Susan Blumenthal's here, who's a member of my administration. Her husband, Congressman Ed Markey, I'm glad he's kind of in charge of a lot of our environmental future. I feel better. As Jack Valenti once said, I sleep better at night knowing that he's there. But do you have to wait for this to make a difference? No. And should you? Absolutely not. Because people like you have more power to affect public good than ever before. The rise of fortunes, unprecedented number of people quite wealthy at an earlier and earlier period in their lives, as quite often has happened in human history whenever economic paradigms change. The rise of the internet as a giving tool has enabled people of very modest means to move the world if they all agree to do the same thing at the same time. After the tsunami, Americans gave $1.2 billion. 30% of our households gave, half of them over the internet. The British, the Dutch, and the Northern Europeans on a per capita basis gave even more than we did. And this is going to be a phenomenon that will only increase in its importance. The linkages between people who have significant accumulated wealth and therefore time and access to learn what to do and how to do it, reaching out then to people with less time and less money who collectively could still double, triple, or quadruple the impact of their efforts. And the rise of the NGOs providing a channel through which this money can be spent to greatest effect, either in partnership with or in spite of both wealthy and poor governments. So we all have something to do. Now, I just want to mention just one thing that I think you should think about based on my own experience. When I started my foundation, I basically didn't have any money, and I still don't have a big endowment. I have to raise the money to do everything I do, and I don't take any government money. I raise government money for poor countries, but I don't take any. No administrative fees, nothing. In our AIDS project, only government funds we've taken, to the best of my knowledge, is that the Indian government and the Chinese government have given us office space and a telephone line, which is kind of interesting to be an NGO working in that circumstance. I appreciate that. But I try to organize and expand markets for public good. And so I ask you to just think about that. And what we did with even with the Clinton Global Initiative, which Laurene mentioned in her introduction, all I really did was to provide a forum for people to come, a forum like this one, and share their thoughts about the major problems of the world and what ought to be done for business leaders, philanthropists, NGO activists from developing as well as developed countries, and political leaders, except I told the people with money that if they came, they had to make a commitment to do something. I didn't care how much money they spent or how much time they spent, but they had to do something in one of the 4 areas we discussed. We never discussed more than 4 areas a year. This year we're doing healthcare, education, economic empowerment, and climate change. And we always do economic empowerment and climate change. We sometimes deal with reconciliation among groups and this whole identity and violence and community issue. We sometimes deal with governance issues in developing countries. But they only get to come back if they make a commitment and keep it. So of the hundreds of people who came the first year, 15 couldn't come back. And about 10 of them actually tried and couldn't believe we wouldn't let them come back. And one of them was a particularly generous supporter of mine when I was president. And I said, you can come to my home for dinner. But this is not about our friendship. This is about the commitment process. This is a serious process. So, you know, that it's worked because what I tried to do was to organize a forum like this one to do matches and then get people to do it. But I want to mention just 3 specific projects we do because we do something that I think all of us can do in various ways. Again, I think you want to build communities and empower individuals. One of the things that people in private philanthropy can do is to help to organize or expand various public goods markets. That is, I could give you 100 examples and stay here till tomorrow morning if we had time, of things that clearly would be done today by people in authority or people with resources in countries all over the world if they knew the facts and knew how to act on the facts. And so one of the great things about the information technology revolution is that the people who are plugged into it should be more aware of not only how the markets work today, but how they could work. I'm talking about public goods markets. So our AIDS project, for example, we now work in 25 countries with 500 people. About 100 of them are full-time volunteers. The others make modest amounts of money. And we are trying to develop models that can not only benefit the treatment of AIDS, but also TB, malaria, other tropical diseases, maternal and child health. And when I'm gone from there, we will leave behind a functioning healthcare system. That's what we're trying to do. But the largest number of lives have been saved by the fact that we organized the medicine market. When we started in 2003, at the beginning of 2003, there were only about 135 or 50,000 people in the developing world outside of Brazil where the government manufactured medicine and could buy medicine at reasonable prices, and they gave it to everybody. Outside of Brazil, there are only about 150,000 people getting medicine. Today, there are probably 1.7 to 8 million people getting medicine in the developing world. By the end of this year, the number may be bumping 3 million or more. We're really getting, and there are, by the way, it needs to, because there are about 6 million people need the medicine to live. But because of the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria, the money that the Bush administration and Congress have put in and other sources of funds, funding is no longer the major barrier now. But it's also no longer the major barrier because of the price of the medicine. Generic AIDS medicine was $500 a person a year when I started in January of 2003. But the markets were so disorganized and information was so absent that the first country in which I went to work, the Bahamas, the wealthiest country in the Caribbean, with a fairly sophisticated government, was paying $3,500 for the same medicine. Now, we pay $10,000 a year for big pharma medicine, but the Canadians and the Europeans get the same medicine for $3,500 a year. That's why they're against our re-importing from Canada. You know, if something terrible happens to all that medicine that goes to Canada, you'll drop dead if you take it, if it comes back. But the point is, the serious point is, the people in the Bahamas were paying for generic medicine manufactured in India and South Africa the same price that Europeans and Japanese and Canadians were paying for big pharmaceuticals medicine. 7 times the listed purchase price. Why? Because they knew nothing about the market. Everybody was just getting into it, and they were buying through 2 different agents, and they were being ripped off. So first thing we did the first week was to get them $500 medicine, which meant overnight they could treat Not quite 7 times as many people because you have, care costs involved, but certainly 6 times as many for the same amount of money. And that's when we decided that maybe our highest and best use first would be to organize this market. So I went around to a bunch of donor countries and got them to promise me a certain amount of money for countries in Africa or the Caribbean. Eventually we went into India. Eventually we went into China, and it kept going, 25 countries. And we asked these companies to go from the business plan they were on, which was high margin, low volume, uncertain payment, even at $500, to a low margin, high volume, absolutely certain payment system. And we made a separate understanding that in the home countries, which were principally South Africa and India, whatever deals we did would go directly to the government. They should never have to go through us for their hometown manufacturers. But anyway, we made this deal. And the price went to $139. Pretty soon the average price in the world dropped from $500 to $192. Today the adult medicine price we get is just about $100 a person a year. We are now selling that medicine in 63 countries, the 25 we work in, and 38 more who have been qualified as able to properly distribute it. And about 600,000 people are getting medicine off this contract now, or about a third of all the people in the world who've been added to the ranks of those getting treatment. And in addition to that, because this happened, the price structure has dropped, so almost everybody now is within 25% of our ceiling price. Same thing happened with children's drugs. When we started, even though it had fewer materials, an annual children's dosage cost $600 because the volume was so much smaller. Because countries were so worried about young adults being wiped out, they didn't have any money to buy the children's drugs. So we had over 500,000 kids just dying every year. If you're born HIV positive, you only have a 50% chance of living to age 2 if you don't get medicine. You only have a 20% chance of living to age 5. And if you're properly cared for and you get nutrition, then you got the same chances people have in other countries to have a more normal life and life expectancy. So we negotiated the price from $600 down to $190. Then along came the French with Unitaid, God bless them, the little airline tax that was devoted to global health. And other countries joined them, many other countries. But the anchor of Unitaid is the receipts from the French airline tax on international travel. And all the money is devoted to global health. They ask us to organize the children's medicine market because just 2 years ago, there were only 10,000 kids in the entire world, with 500,000 dying a year, only 10,000 outside Brazil and Thailand, where the government gave it to the kids, getting medicine. I went around and raised the money, principally from some British philanthropists, to double that. And then, so we went to 10,000 more, then we were going to 25,000 more. Then along came the Unitaids. We have negotiated that price that was $600 2 years ago down to $60, a 90% price reduction. There is no longer a financial barrier to keeping these children alive. I just saw several hundred of them in orphanages and hospitals in Cambodia late last year. They will live now. If, no, I'm not letting you off that easy. Thank you, but they will live if, but only if, there is a health infrastructure there that will enable us to identify, treat, and care for these children while we're trying to increase awareness and prevent it. Laurene mentioned a child in Lesotho. Lesotho has like the third highest AIDS rate in the world, 24, 25%. And we work there. And it's trying to become the first country in the world that has universal opt-out testing for people 12 or over. So you can say you don't want to be tested, but they come and try to convince you. And so we have all these people who work with us and go up, and a third of the country is unreachable except by on foot are an animal, so mountainous. One of the women who is one of our spokespeople in Lesotho, it's a rural place, you got is a woman named Sabang Sataka, who's about 24 years old now. She became HIV positive because she was raped. In many primitive cultures, that would be enough to make her just give up on life, and she would be looked down on, and people would treat her like it was her fault. And it breaks a lot of people still in rural conservative cultures. I wish this young woman were my child. I would be proud of her. She goes into these villages and says, okay, I got the virus because I was raped coming home from school one day. And I had two choices. I could just pack it in and feel that there was something wrong with me. But I thought about it, and somehow I don't think this was my fault. And I refuse to be a victim. I refuse to give up. I refuse to give in, and you should not either. But you should be tested, and you should never do to any other person what was done to me, or run the risk of having it done to you. She's our best spokesperson, because it almost doesn't matter what words come out of her mouth when people know she's HIV positive and they see her standing there strong and healthy and dignified and whole and trying to lift them up. But we have to do this. Paul Farmer is now living full-time in Rwanda. A lot of you know him from his wonderful work in Haiti, where, among other things, they have not had a tuberculosis death in his catchment area, where he treats 10 times as many people or more than he has professionals for. They have not had a tuberculosis death since 1988. Not one. Where the HIV positive people take their medicine with greater efficiency than they do in the United States. So we're trying to develop a model in Rwanda that then we can sort of say, okay, this works, we want to cart this around. But the point is, we organize markets. And if you want to talk about that some more, we can. So then we started this development project in cooperation with a Scottish philanthropist named Tom Hunter. We just started in Rwanda and Malawi. So our first year in Rwanda, we went out to this area of 415,000 people, and we discovered that the farmers were living in an unorganized market. They didn't know anything about market conditions, and they couldn't even think about marketing their products because there was such a shortage of food. People were hungry. Keep in mind, the whole country's per capita income is still not $1 a day. So these people were really poor. So we organized the market for fertilizer. We negotiated with European and Middle Eastern fertilizer producers. And we essentially said we're going to buy 3.5 times as much fertilizer than ever before, and we want a cut on the price. And they said, but petroleum's going up, and we need to raise the price. And they said, no, we want a cut. We're going to pay you the day you deliver this, and you should give us a cut. So they gave us a 30% price break. Then we went to the microcredit financiers, and we got a 30 to 50% break on the interest rates. Again, same strategy: high volume, low margin, certain payment. Then we worked with the farmers to change some farming techniques. Anyway, in the traditional crops, we had a 300 to 400% increase the first year. We got into crop diversification. We went from hungry people to food surpluses in farm markets, and we're off to the races. But the point I want to make is, the main thing we did was to organize the markets. Now, Laurene mentioned that I was working with Ken Livingstone, the mayor of London, on this large cities project. There are 40 of the biggest cities in the world that have entered into a compact to try to jointly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Ken asked me to see if this strategy of organizing and enlarging the market would work in the climate change area. So we are trying to do two things. First of all, to see whether we can get some huge volume purchases of easily available energy efficiency products, and set up a financing mechanism which will enable cities in the developing world to pay for it quickly. And, who knows? We're going to have our first big conference in New York in May, and stay tuned. But the point I want to ask all of you is that this is something we should all be thinking about. Because if you're interested in both community building and empowerment, nothing empowers people so much as an organized, efficient, clearly understandable economical market? Nothing. Then all the politics goes away. I mean, why is Walmart, which is generally viewed as one of the more conservative companies in America, going to reduce its packaging by 5%? Because it saves them in the supply chain $3.4 billion and has the greenhouse gas effect of taking 203,000 diesel trucks, which get 6 miles to the gallon, off the road. They are trying to sell the rest of us 100 million compact fluorescent bulbs. They are selling bulbs to people who did not know what a compact fluorescent bulb was before they were on the shelves in Walmart. If they sell them all and people screw them in and use them, it will have the effect, the greenhouse gas effect, of taking 700,000 cars off the road. The light bulbs. There are all these things we need to be thinking about where we can organize resources in a way that have ripple effects and create, they're inherently empowering every time you do that. And the best examples by far, the easiest ones, are in the area of climate change. But I think it's very important to see how and whether we can do this in developing countries. Because unless the United States sets a good example, but then persuades first China and India and later other rapidly growing developing countries that they don't have to get rich the way we did, we cannot conquer this challenge. So we have to be able to prove that there's an alternative strategy. I promise you, most economic decision makers in the developing world do not know that in the last few years, Denmark has increased the size of its economy by 50% and increased its energy usage 0, not 1 watt, and reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by producing now 22% from electricity. But from wind. For the developing world, the most important thing is not the wind energy. The most important thing is they grew the economy 50% with no energy increase. Most people don't think that's possible now. So would it be better if the U.S. adopted carbon limits and had a cap and trade system and set a good... Absolutely. I hope it happens. Should the rest of you hang around waiting for it to happen and using that as a reason not to do anything? Absolutely not. As long as oil is over $50 a barrel, virtually every conceivable clean energy and energy conservation strategy you can think of can be made economically viable in wealthy as well as developing countries. That's the point I want to make. That's what you can do. If you're part of tomorrow's economy, you know instinctively how to do the two things that we have to do: organize and expand markets and empower people. And that they are two sides of the same coin, building new communities and giving people greater capacity. So that's what I try to do. Will it work in climate change? Will it work in development in poor countries as it has with AIDS medicine? I'm not positive, but I sure think so. I certainly think so. And it isn't like we have anything more important to do. However wealthy you are and however insulated you think you are from all this, unless you wish your grandchildren to live in a bubble with pumped-in air and never see a tree or float around in an area that used to be land or look askance at every single person that passes them of a different race or a different faith, you don't have anything better to do. And besides, it's fun. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how this works. Am I supposed to organize my own Q&A? If you have a question, we got a mic.
Check.
Oh,
Yes, President Clinton, many of us have always wished we could have do-overs or have second chances. Should you become our first man, where do you envision your humanitarian efforts being directed, and how will our government's aid and humanitarian programs change from how they operate now, and as I've heard you say, have generally operated for decades?
Well, maybe it's because I survived heart surgery, but my view is I get a do-over every day. And I think it's it's a kind of an interesting way to think about it. Well, you know, when in my first 2 years when we had a Democratic Congress, we were burdened by huge debts and crushing interest rates. We would have gotten dramatic increases in foreign assistance otherwise. Then when the Republicans took over, they were totally hostile to all this, ironically until the Christian evangelicals began, if you'll have to forgive me because I come out of the community, they began to read the whole Bible. And they got, and they got interested in, to give them credit, they got interested in AIDS, they got interested in poverty. They supported me in the global debt relief effort in 2000, and they supported President Bush's jacking up the AIDS funding. And I know a lot of people didn't like the abstinence portion of that, but that was really just a third of the 20% that had to go to prevention. There's still a lot of money out there. We probably wasted more buying too many drugs that were more expensive from the big companies, even at $1,000 and $1,500 a piece, but still it was a lot more money. They saved a lot of lives. And we should realize that there is a huge sea change now in American attitudes. And I think that this coming election is going to be the only one in my lifetime where Americans will actually be influenced in their voting by what is necessary to restore our country's standing in the world. And the people actually do care about this. So if I were to do it again, first of all, I won't be making the decisions. I think that's important. But I would advocate for our at least going to the international standard of 17/10 of 1% of GDP. I would advocate in assistance. I would advocate that we work harder to be cooperative with communities like this one, so that we try to coordinate and leverage what the private as well as the public funds can do. I would do a lot of very, very serious development work. We did that before. We gave millions of dollars, for example, to support microcredit loans, millions of microcredit loans a year when I was president. I would try to do a lot more sophisticated development work, and I'd get all the kids in the world in school and try to get them decent learning materials and bearable facilities and train teachers. And then I would just take these healthcare problems one by one and knock them off insofar as you possibly could. But I think that one of the things that the government of the United States can do that would be really helpful is to build the capacity, the public capacity of governments in other countries. I love trying to help Rwanda build a healthcare system, but let's be realistic here. The one reason I can do it is they have a well-organized government. It's the most densely populated country in Africa because there's 8 million people on a little relatively small piece of land. And we have a chance to do it, but then if we get a good model and we say, okay, look what Paul Farmer did in Haiti, look what we've done in Rwanda, this works, somebody else has to figure out how to make it happen over a wider range. You know, one of the things that makes our AIDS work pretty effective in India, besides the fact that the companies that make the drugs are there, is that they have 800,000 doctors still. In India, doctors are like school teachers were in America back in the 50s. It's overwhelming to me. You still go in these little villages, and all the money being made by the dot-com zillionaires, you know, there's an 80-year-old doctor there who still never thought about anything but just being there taking care of people. So, I mean, I think that we have a chance to build infrastructure with greater government funding and greater cooperation with the private sector. I know a lot about this stuff I never knew before. For example, usually when you're sitting in the White House, the last thing you think about is whether you've organized the market for AIDS medicine properly. Or could you cut a deal on the instantaneous test and cut the price from $1 to 50 cents like we did? Or could you go to the providers of the testing equipment, which, by the way, are all in developed countries, and negotiate an 80% reduction in the price of the equipment and the testing, and get them to fold the price of the equipment in to the testing purchases on a monthly basis so they can amortize it over time and poor countries can afford it. That's just stuff that normally, I think that's one thing I could bring to government decision making that was just totally not there before. I just never thought about that until I got out here and saw just how disorganized a lot of these public goods markets are. And as I said, in my view, it is right now, apart from the absence of leadership in the United States and buy-in from China and India across the board on the necessity of doing something on emissions that are really biting, apart from that, the biggest problem is there's a world of good to be done out there and a world of economic opportunity to be created and a world of social problems to be solved, and most people see it as drinking castor oil, when it is in fact the greatest opportunity of the age, both for the American economy and from the world at large. Yes, in the back. Anybody, go ahead.
Oh, President Clinton, it's a great honor to have you here. So thank you. And just drawing on your extraordinary experience going around the world and in the capacity you've been, I was wondering, when you consider the long-term well-being of our species and the planet, what do you think the single greatest barrier to affecting real systemic changes?
I think that the biggest barrier is a lack of knowledge, not the knowledge that this is a problem. You know, people can be vaguely aware that climate change is a problem. People can be vaguely aware that all these resource depletion issues are out there. But the world, the interdependent world, requires the ability not only to know about all these different things, but to think synthetically about them, to synthesize apparently unconnected trends, facts, and events, to form a pattern which enables you to see the future in its best and worst options. And one of the reasons I give the kind of talks that I did today, and usually in greater detail on the front end, is that I think most people are basically decent people. You know, yes, we have real specific problems in energy. The old energy economy is bureaucratic, well-organized, rich as can be, and well-connected politically. And change is always hard. Yeah, that's a big problem. But the fundamental problem is, in almost no society would people allow self-destruction to occur if they understood, if they could think in a synthesizing way and put all these apparently disconnected things together, and if they could believe that they could make a difference. So that may sound naive, but that's really what I believe. You know, the human enterprise has a way of rescuing itself when it's on the edge of self-destruction. And if you think about it, all of human history, in part, is a story of larger and larger and larger circles of positive interdependence, imperiled by the technological capacity of a few people to kill larger and larger and larger numbers of their fellow human beings. And we dodged a lot of bullets in the 20th century. You know, we only had one big atomic explosion, well, two, but in one sequence. And 9 million people died in World War I, 12 million in World War II, 20 million in the purges between the wars and afterward in the Soviet Union, 6 million in the Holocaust, who knows how many in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, 2 million in Cambodia alone, millions in tribal wars in Africa. We did a lot of killing. I think it's important that before you give up on the world, you realize that we just escaped the bloodiest century in human history. And I think it is unlikely that this century will claim as many innocent lives through political violence. But this century, we have to understand the systemic threats to our future, from climate change, from resource depletion, from being all thrown together and saying we don't care that 130 million kids never darken a schoolhouse door and another 400 or 500 million don't get an adequate education and all the other things, all the health care problems. If that's what I think the biggest problem is not the lack of knowledge, but the lack of the ability to put the knowledge in a pattern and to see what the consequences of various courses of action are. I really do believe if leaders understood it, they'd do it. And I'll give you one example, or two. China. When the SARS epidemic showed up in Hong Kong and then transferred to Canada, we knew it could kill tens of thousands of people and in a hurry. And the Chinese were at first in denial. So the kids in China demonstrated, but instead of going into Tiananmen Square where they could be rolled up, they jammed the government's websites. And to its everlasting credit, the Chinese government turned on a dime, began to cooperate. 5 people died, I think, from SARS. If you look at the Chinese response to AIDS, there was lots of denial. Then, 2003, I was invited to Tsinghua University to give a speech. Senior Chinese ministers came, and AIDS activists raised hell. I just on my kind of instinctively asked him to come up on the stage. All these ministers shook hands with him. It was the first time any Chinese official had ever been seen on national television shaking hands with somebody who had AIDS. Within 10 days, the Prime Minister had 10 AIDS activists in his office on national television. Within a few weeks, the President of China was in the hospital holding the hands of people who were dying of AIDS. All of a sudden, boom, they turned it around. China now has better automobile emission standards than we do. Now, they have other problems. I'm just saying, I really do believe that the biggest problem, and that's why I think things like this are so important and why I came out here, the biggest problem is you have an understanding base, not just a knowledge base, an understanding base. The average person looks at the evening news at night and they say, oh my God, they're fighting in the south of Lebanon and the north of Israel again. Oh my God, there's a chicken in Romania with avian influenza and they had to kill every chicken within 3 square kilometers. And Britney Spears shaved her head. How do I put this together? How can I be... I said that how do I distinguish between the trend lines and the headlines? And I say that, I feel terrible for that young woman. Do you remember when you were in your 20s? Some of you still are. Most everybody is overcome with angst about something, and if you get real famous and real rich and you're real beautiful and you have all these real problems, and all of a sudden they play them out in the tabloids, how would you have done if you'd lived through the pressures that she's lived through? So I'm very sort of sympathetic. I think it's terrible the way she's been dragged out through here. The point I'm trying to make is, suppose you're just out there and you're a citizen and you run a little business and you're trying to make a profit, and this is what you're seeing all the time. How are you supposed to get to the point that all of you are at now that got you into these chairs today? That's the big challenge. Yes?
To help the people to get the cure and to do something substantial for the people to save the life of the children in Africa. And as a goodwill of, ambassador of UNICEF, my frustration is how can we get the leaders of Africa to step up to the plate to help us really, all of us together, to really do something against the pandemic of HIV and AIDS?
Well, I think, first of all, my belief is that most of them want to now, and they know that there's no real political benefit in being in denial. When I started this just a few years ago, I mean, really, there were a lot of people who just didn't want to think about it, because that's not what they ran for office to do, and they weren't really sure what the facts were. And I think that denial is not much of an option anymore. I think the best thing to do, the best thing you can do, is to give people a way to act effectively. That's why what I try to do with my foundation, if I had more money and more people, I'd do more. But I don't go into countries unless the government asks me. Then if the government asks me to go in, I say, okay, now you have to have a plan. We will help you develop it. It must be your plan with your commitment to train the personnel, to put in place the clinics, to do all these things, so that we not only deal with AIDS, but it's TB, malaria, maternal health, the tropical diseases, the whole everything. And this is working for us pretty well in 25 countries because we get the commitment on the front end. That's one of the things I think the rest of the NGO community can do. In other words, we should all be more sensitive, not just to do, if we can, not just to do one-off projects, no matter how good they are. If there is ever an option to get the government to ask us to participate in systematic change, because in the end, it's not our country, it's yours, right? And in the end, something can happen. I mean, you know, my plane could go down going to or from Africa on my annual trip this summer. And even if it doesn't, someday something will happen. But what I've tried to do is to organize it so that no matter what happens, they have greater tools to deal with this and a greater knowledge base to go forward. That's what I think all of us ought to be thinking about. Every single day, if you work in another country, just remember you're there because of interdependence, but it's still their home, not yours. And you need to be trying to make sure that if anything happens to you, you need to imagine, if something happened to me tomorrow, would they be marginally better off on a permanent basis? If something happened to me a year from now, would they be markedly better off on a permanent basis? That's what I think we have to do. In other words, you know, I keep working on this, but I find that a lot of the political leaders, they go through a series of stages, the first being denial. And I'm talking about people that basically want to do a good job. But these African leaders, you know, you just think about it. If you had run for president of Benin 10 years ago and you've been elected, and say, what do I want to do? I want to educate young girls. I'm tired of our girls being discriminated against. I want to give young women a chance. Plus, we'll never be a modern economy. Now that I'm doing this, I want other people to give me money so we don't have to charge school fees. Now that we're doing that, I want people to invest for economic development. And then, boom, one day you get a report that you've got this horrible AIDS pandemic and people are going to start dropping like flies, but it costs so much money you have to cut your education budget by 50%. So the initial reaction of a lot of people was to just be in denial. Like, you know, every politician finds this, by the way. You get elected to office and you tell people, vote for me and I'll do A, B, and C. And then 3 days after you're in, it turns out that D is the biggest problem. And if you don't deal with D, you never get to A, B, and C. But for somewhere between a day and several years, you give yourself a pity party, just hoping D will go away so you can do A, B, and C, because after all, that's what you said you wanted to do, right? Now you laugh, but I mean, to take President Bush on his own terms, vote for me and I'll cut taxes for wealthy people, repeal Bill Clinton's environmental regulations, involve churches in social justice, and be tough around the world. And then, boom, 9/11 happens. They did not believe that Osama bin Laden was as big a threat to America as Saddam Hussein, even though, and because their ideology didn't permit it. It wasn't what they were thinking. So that presented him with an enormous challenge to the way he thought of the world. This happens to everybody, and that's what AIDS did to a lot of leaders. When Thabo Mbeki became president of South Africa, I know what was in his mind, and Hardy said, okay, Mandela was great. He gave us a new democracy, and he proved that white South Africans and natives could work together, and that we could even, a lot of these tribal problems with the Zulus and all, we'll manage it all. We'll get everybody in the government. We've got a political process. We can thrive. I know economics. I'm of a new generation. I know more about this than Madiba could ever have had the opportunity to know. So he gave us a modern political system. I will give us a modern economy. And boom, it's got the largest AIDS load in the world. Now, I'm not saying I approve of all the decisions made by the South African government in this. I'm just saying, how many times has that ever happened to you? If you live long enough and you take enough responsibility and you take on a job where you want to do something and then it turns out you have to do something else, this will happen to you. I still believe that's the biggest problem. We've got to show the African leaders that there are systems to deal with this without which they never get to the other things they care about. Yes?
Mr. President, this is the last question, I'm sorry to say.
Global Philanthropy Forum, Ashoka, Skoll Foundation, Global Philanthropy Forum, Ashoka, Skoll Foundation, and others are leaders in really making private people doing public good, civil society, the fastest growing movement in human history. But what would you suggest, because I feel that that is absolutely critical, and you obviously do too, what are the key elements to move this even faster on a global basis?
Well, ironically, I think it could be moved faster on a global basis if people of means and people of modest incomes knew on a more continuing way what they could do to cooperate with people who are already in this work. That is, there's some really interesting websites now where you can go and find out who's doing what you're interested in and send them money. I mean, we've made enormous progress in this. But I'm telling you about, a lot of the United Nations, let's just take them, a lot of the United Nations work accepts and needs private contributions, whether it's the Millennium Villages or UNICEF and the work that we did together in the tsunami countries, or I could give you lots of other examples. What I think the next step of this is to have an information bank which shows people who are not yet in the circle of givers, here are the opportunities, and you really will get a good return on your investment. I don't mean a profit. You will prevail. And by the way, here's a list of the countries and the international organizations, as well as the big private networks, philanthropic networks, who want partners. Like I said, I actually like working with government partners. Sometimes it's important to lobby against government or to advocate too. But if you have a government partner, you have a chance to increase the systematic capacity of a developing country. And that is very important. If you think about all of you just stop and think about your life right now. What got you from when you were 6 years old into this chair? Now, this is a very diverse group, and a lot of you have overcome great personal obstacles. But almost without exception, every person in this room got to this chair today because at critical junctures in your life, when you had to make a decision about how you would live, you knew that there was a predictable connection between the effort you exerted and the consequence that followed. Most of the people that I start working with in these areas where AIDS has been ravaged, or where there's no way to make a living, or where the farmers can't even bring in a crop, and they're doing self-destructive things like destroying the topsoil, people actually don't believe there is a predictable connection. And it turns everyone into a social guerrilla. You're just out there grabbing around from day to day, and if you're really smart, and a lot of them are smarter than most of us, you learn to dance on the pin, and you survive longer. What we have to do is to establish predictable connections for people that are just as smart and hardworking and as imaginative as we are. So to take it to scale, that's what I would do. I would have the international organizations, the national governments, and developing and developed countries alike actively solicit, be involved in, and catalog opportunities for involvement. And then I think, the big websites and the big NGO umbrella groups, like, Ashoka is, I hope I live long enough to see Drayton win the Nobel Prize. I've known him for all my life. I think I campaigned for 14 years for Muhammad Yunus, and a guy who was with him at the Nobel ceremony said that after it was over, one of the guys from the Nobel committee came up and said, well, maybe Bill Clinton will quit calling me now. But I think these are the kinds of people I think we should be lifting up around the world. People who have shown that it is possible to change the way we all live. And so, anyway, that's my advice. I think we need more explicit long-term partnerships with international organizations, national governments, in developed and developing countries, and with the big NGO umbrella groups. That's how we got to take it to scale. Because there are lots of people out there I know now who are making a lot of money, but they don't know anything like as much as you do. And they would spend their money, but like, you know, Jim asked me this question about how to handle the change the government program. Okay, so he made a decision to live in a certain way and to spend his money in a certain way. But it was a lot of trouble for him. I mean, it wasn't like it's not like he hasn't studied this. How do you think he knew to ask me that question? Right? So there are all these other people who have X amount of money who are generally well disposed, who don't care about dying with it and don't want to buy another yacht or another airplane. And then there are all these people that just have a little bit they'd like to give every week, but they don't know for sure that it will make a difference. So anything we can do to systematically both leverage the impact of the contribution and show people that it will make a difference and be held accountable in a scorable way for results will accelerate this movement. Thank you very much.
Okay.